Today, we start a series on the world's fairs that occurred from the late 1700s to the mid-1900s in America. Now, many claim these expos were nothing more than a convenient way to disguise and then destroy many of the old world Tartarian buildings that needed to be erased because their existence pointed to a civilization many in history want you to believe never existed. We see buildings that seem to have been around much longer than we're told. If one researches some of the timelines for when cities were founded here in America, it seems there may have been magnificent buildings and advanced city infrastructure already in place in some cases. These discrepancies are not just in one or two places either. They seem to be everywhere. San Francisco, Chicago, Omaha, St. Louis, Buffalo, and many other cities. Many claim these cities were more aptly described as being inherited rather than settled. Abandoned cities with magnificent structures that were simply found. Why would such magnificent cities be abandoned? Well, this is where the mud flood theory comes in. It is theorized that a great mud flood may have wiped out these civilizations. We see countless buildings, not only in America, but worldwide, that were partially covered in, well, mud. Hundreds of these old buildings exist today. Some have been dug out, and others we see windows and doors partially below ground level. Let's look at some slides. Now, were all these mud flood buildings from the lost empire of Tartaria? That connection would be difficult to make with certainty, but evidence is mounting that the lost empire of Tartaria did in fact exist, and a concerted and coordinated effort was made to erase its history altogether. In fact, it only takes a surface-level investigation into the subject of Tartaria to prove its existence. Hundreds of old world maps depicting the borders with flags and many indicating its kingdom have even stretched over much of the northern hemisphere. Both flags of the kingdom and its emperors have been discovered, as well as written accounts of its people and history, and even a lost language. The next logical question many have is, why would such an empire be hidden? Well, there are various reasons given by various people, but again, that's a question that may never be answered with certainty. But make no mistake, that very question has given rise to much speculation, some of which is so wild as to cast doubt on the whole theory itself. Yes, you'll hear some fantastic tales for sure when peeking down this rabbit hole. Now, I'll simply cover one proof here today that Tartaria did exist, and a cover-up was indeed executed. Many who follow the Tartarian mystery will be very familiar with it, but those who are just getting into the subject, you may find it very compelling. It comes from a source none other than our very own CIA. Now, many today would ask, can we even trust the CIA? And I would agree that is a fair question. Perhaps not, but my only point here is that it's not from a source that is widely considered salacious. This is an excerpt of the declassified CIA document created in 1957 and declassified in 1998. You can go online to the official CIA website and verify it for yourself. We read, "Or let us take the matter of history, which along with religion, language, and literature constitute the core of a people's cultural heritage. Here again, the communists have interfered in a shameless manner. For example, on 9 August 1944, the Central Committee of the Communist Party, sitting in Moscow, issued a directive ordering the party's Tartar Provincial Committee to proceed to a scientific revision of the history of Tartaria, to liquidate serious shortcomings and mistakes of a nationalistic character committed by individual writers and historians in dealing with Tartar history. In other words, Tartar history was to be rewritten. Let us be frank, was to be falsified in order to eliminate references to great Russian aggressions and to hide the facts of the real course of Tartar-Russian relations. And this was no isolated case. In every Muslim area within the USSR, historians on orders of the Communist Party have rewritten history to distort the facts so that the Russians always appear in a good light. Needless to say, histories which represent the facts truthfully have been withdrawn and destroyed, so that the present and future generation of Muslims are forever denied the chance of learning the true facts of their nation's past. So the two takeaways this document seems to suggest is that 1, Tartaria did exist, and 2, there was some effort to erase its history. Now that, however, is not our subject of investigation today. We want to look at the possible connection that the many World's Fairs may have had to this lost kingdom, and specifically to World's Fairs in America. Now remember, America was supposedly a vast, unexplored, and uncivilized territory when the first settlers arrived. Now, if advanced cities and architecture were already there, and there were those that wanted that evidence erased, the question becomes, were these mysterious World's Fairs a means to that end? Now, the majority of the supposed Tartarian buildings were destroyed decades before the World's Fairs, but there were many that still remained, and there are those that claim many of the fairs were a final send-off for some of the structures that remained. A grand send-off with all the fanfare one could imagine. Let's look at these fairs. This is from a Wikipedia page. Make sure I get over there. The list of these expositions is long and quite extensive. And as you'll see, the scope was literally worldwide. The 1790s, they're said to have begun. In the early 1800s, you see just a few into the 1840s, where you see it start to pick up, and we have many more in the 1850s, in the 1860s, and again, pay attention to all the various flags, all the various countries and nations that held these grand expositions. In the 1870s, we have a pretty extensive list, and probably even more in the 1880s and 1890s as well. Quite a list into the 1900s. And they continued on, but lesser in frequency as we got into the 1940s and really beyond our scope that we would be looking at today. Get you back to some pictures here. Now, every fair was not a cover-up of the Tartarian Empire. Okay, the stated purpose was to show off the art, industry, and the technology of the era. But what we're examining is not whether or not some of these fairs actually had a dual purpose, one more clandestine in nature, Many of these fairs were straightforward expositions, while others, well, let's just say they seemed to be very suspicious, or at the very least, quite odd. Here are just a few images of the various fairs from all over the world. A particular interest to the similarities of both the architecture and layouts, as we'll discuss both later in the presentation. The first one is from Amsterdam. Next, we see Argentina. A couple from Australia. Berlin, Brazil. Here in the United States, very famous one is Chicago. In Denmark, Ecuador, Hanoi, Guatemala, a couple here from Hungary, Ireland, a couple from London. This is Melbourne, New Zealand, Omaha, Nebraska, Paris, France, Philadelphia, which this is one we'll probably do one on the series, it's considered the first in the United States. This building here, I think, is the main building, which is said to have covered over 21 physical acres. Spain, St. Louis, another one of particular interest, as well as Chicago. Sweden, and Buffalo. Now, after viewing all these magnificent structures, would you say most of them were temporary and made with cheap plaster? Well, that is the story we are told. We are told that the vast majority of these buildings were temporary designed for the world's fairs, and since they were only temporary, they would need to be destroyed afterwards. But were these actually old world Tartarian buildings instead, that they were needing to eliminate to sweep away the evidence? Well, evidence that may support such a claim begins with the eerie similarities that most, if certainly many of these world's fairs shared. What I've found in my research is there seems to be a rather uncanny list of similarities these world's fairs had that in some cases seem to defy sound reasoning. Here are the commonalities. Number one, they all seem to demonstrate elaborate and exquisitely grand architecture. Now, the first three images we'll look at are not from the world's fairs. They're just to give you an idea of the magnificence of old world architecture. This is absolutely amazing structures. Now, this one is from the World's Fair in Chicago. The grand nature of these World's Fairs buildings is simply undeniable. Many, if all, not exhibiting old world architecture we rarely, if ever, see today. The ornateness and attention to detail is just quite extraordinary. This is, of course, one of the many reasons people suspect these structures may actually have been from our past, not just mere reproductions of those bygone days. Be careful, because even if you've never really cared too much about architecture in the past, when you really start to pay attention to old world architecture, you may become hooked. Find yourself pausing to take a closer look at every old building you come across. The architecture of today becomes almost obscene in comparison. This is what we see today. This is what we saw then. Today. Then. Today. And then. And one more of today's terrible architecture and what we saw then. Now, if you didn't know any better, you might think these primitive architects were actually more advanced than ours today. 2, the architecture seemed to be similar in style with a great deal of Greco-Roman influence. The common elements of the Greek columns, arches, and domes are almost universally prevalent. Many who don't buy the official narrative point to this as evidence that the similarities are because they were all built by the same builders of the same kingdom. Similar buildings from similar sources, so to speak. And why else would we see this similarity? Why wouldn't we see vastly different architectural styles from the many different World's Fairs, instead of an almost purely consistent style for each fair? They pretty much all seem to have had the same inspiration in terms of the architectural design, which again may point to a similar designer. Number 3, many of the layouts seem to resemble how a government square or a capitol complex might be laid out. Now, the first 2 slides are of supposed modern government complexes, one in Delaware and one in Pennsylvania. But in adding these slides, I realized our Capitol buildings are another anomaly I need to look into. Many of our Capitol buildings bear an eerie resemblance to old world architecture themselves. Now, look at the layout of many of these World's Fairs. In fact, many of the fairs even incorporated government names for their buildings. Many were called government buildings. Others were named for departments of government, such as agriculture, arts, horticulture, and education. The layouts, in many cases, included a great square that many of the buildings were arranged around, almost hinting of them being the city's government square. Perhaps where ordinary citizens may go to handle their dealings with the government in one convenient, well-planned area. These are World's Fairs images. Again, you see the square, the surrounding government-type buildings. This is a diagram, and you can see the layout. Again, you have a central area here with a big square and then surrounding buildings. This is St. Louis in a grand square. These government-type, Capitol-type buildings all arranged around. And this one we see a similar structure, and we even have water incorporated. So this would have been extremely difficult to clear, especially with the lack of modern heavy equipment back then. But again, we see that same type of a structure. Number 4, many, but not all, were supposedly constructed before the period of gas engines or heavy equipment, meaning they would have had to utilize primitive means of construction, like horse-drawn wagons and hand tools versus machine construction. The following images are mainly of pictures I could find of what type of equipment this era had at their disposal. Imagine how difficult the site and foundation work alone would have been without bulldozers, tractors, and other heavy equipment, not to mention the grand structures themselves. Just the clearing and foundation. The use of primitive machines, hand tools, and labor to build these structures almost defies reason. Many propose these structures were actually built in a time long past where advanced technology existed, much of it focused on free energy, making the impossible seem possible. Here we'll look at a few examples of the equipment they had at their disposal. Now, these aren't World's Fairs, but just to give you an idea of the type of equipment they would have had back then. This is almost like a 18-wheeler trailer, perhaps used to carry longer beams for construction. Now, if you're clearing out area, this would be a monumental task using these horse-drawn wagons, and we can see no heavy equipment down there. I guess we are supposed they were using shovels. Again, this grand architecture. Now, we did have a train, tracks coming through, so the train could at least deliver the materials, but we don't see any heavy equipment around. What we see is manual labor. They certainly did not have this type of equipment at their disposal, which would have obviously made construction much easier and sped the process along. In fact, a lot of the reason I'm showing you this images is for you to imagine just how long it would take to clear these areas and build these structures, because the time frames they give us do not add up. Now here we're starting to see some machines here. This looks like a steam shovel that's filling in the horse-drawn wagons. So this would probably be early 1900s, but again, many of these World's Fairs that we'll examine occurred much earlier than this era. Now, some in the early 1900s and above or later would have had access to some of this type of equipment, but there's two steam shovels here, and they've got a huge mound of dirt over here to the bottom right. I guess they're shoveling in one bucket at a time into all these various wagons. Quite a lengthy process, I would say. Here I'm guessing we're in the late 1700s, 1780s maybe. We see electric poles up maybe a little bit later. But we see again the horse-drawn wagons, and we see manual labor. We see pickaxes and shovels. So this would have been the common tools used to move dirt. Again, this is a farming picture, but again, the premise hopefully is clear. And this would be later, I'm guessing, 1920s. Actually have an old dump truck, which would have sped things up. Unfortunately, that wouldn't have helped in the 1800s, but would have been quite a help afterwards. Here we're seeing, again, the majority manual labor. We're seeing horse and wagons. We do see a crane operated back there, and I don't know if that's steam or coal burning coming up there, but even with the help of some of this equipment, you can get the picture. These structures would have taken quite a while. And finally, I thought this one was interesting. This appears to be diesel and water-cooled, but it's pretty interesting tractor. It would have made work a little bit quicker, but again, the era before that, when they didn't even have these, or the era when they did have these, would be nothing in compared to the heavy equipment that we have at our disposal today. 5. Many of the fairs covered enormous areas of land and consisted of sometimes hundreds of building structures. We see fairs that literally covered hundreds of acres and 200 or more buildings, supposedly all constructed for the purposes of the fair. The mere size and scope of the fairs seem to also defy reasoning when compared to their purpose. Now, if all or most of the structures already existed, as some contend, this wouldn't be an issue. let's just take a look at a few of the images of the scope. And a lot of the time this would just be the main complex, but there would be other areas that were developed for the World's Fair outside of that, covering literally hundreds of acres. This is in Chicago. I think we've seen this image before. Another of just the massive area that these fairs would have covered. This is St. Louis, and a nice aerial panorama of just how large a venture this would have been. And again, just the size and scope is pretty incredible. Just keep that in mind. We move forward in this series. These were by no means a small fair. 6, the vast majority of these structures were supposedly temporary. Yes, temporary. The structures were many times constructed of a material called staff, a combination of plaster and burlap, overlaying a temporary wood framework. Now, this of course works well for the official narrative of the buildings being temporary. One might imagine how such grand architecture could be quickly molded into permanent looking structures with this cheap material, because certainly permanent granite structures wouldn't be constructed for just a temporary fair. But one might also wonder if they were actual granite and brick structures, and the narrative given of them being constructed of staff gave the perfect reason to tear them all down. I mean, we wouldn't want these rickety old buildings made of staff to fall down on people later on, would we? The bottom line here is that it defies reason for such magnificent architecture to be built for a 3 to 6 month event. There's simply no getting around that fact. See the Court of Honor. And yeah, we're just going to throw these buildings up really quickly out of some cheap plaster and have a fair for 3 to 6 months and then tear it all down. Yeah, this bridge would be no problem to get that built and engineered. Well worth it for a 3 to 6 month fair. Number 7, they all seem to have very short, if not impossible, construction time periods. As we mentioned earlier, many of the fairs covered hundreds of acres and contained hundreds of grand buildings. We pointed out that there was the one World's Fair building that was said to be over 21 acres in area just by itself. Now, all the buildings were said to have been slapped up in periods ranging from 1 year to just 3. Many contractors today, with their advanced heavy equipment, say these time frames are impossible, and that is with today's technology. Now, with the technology they had, back then, many said it's absurd to believe the official timelines of the build-outs. I can just imagine the bids going in for this type of structure to be cleared and then built in a year or two, and these horse and wagons, and then the contractor saying, yeah, sure, it's no problem whatsoever. Moving on, number 8. In many cases, the fairs only lasted from a few months to a year. So all this work and money would have gone into these fairs for only a short period of enjoyment. Such time, effort, and resources poured out for a relatively short return of public enjoyment. You can probably see why it just doesn't seem logical to many who question this official narrative. Number 9, upon the fair's completion, many of the structures were either torn down or destroyed by mysterious fires. Now, this fact alone throws up so many red flags to question the official narrative. Even if the events were just to be a few months long, why the hurry to demolish the buildings so shortly afterward? Why not keep them around a little longer? No, they seem to be in a hurry to immediately tear them down, or in many cases were burned by mysterious fires, many suspected of arson. Let's look at a few images of this demolition of these World's Fairs areas. Here, leveled to the ground. Here in partial deconstruction or demolition. This one's pretty flattened. I don't see a whole lot of plaster laying around. Looks like more permanent building structures, but maybe they removed all that plaster out ahead of time. Here we see some of these grand structures meeting their demise, and some partially destructed. Then the fires, the mysterious fires. World's Fair here on fire, and I understand we didn't have the fire departments we have today to help put these out. They were more common. However, the similarity is beyond a believable commonality. Here again, some World's Fair structures ravaged by fires. More of the same, kind of a before and after of the fire that took out one of the most amazing World's Fairs ever, the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. This is the remains of the Crystal Palace. More fire damage. Just seems a little odd that we had to get these buildings torn down as quickly as possible, or so many mysterious fires. Moving on. For our last similarity, number 10, only a very select few of the buildings remain today, but some do. It's almost as if some of these grabblers just couldn't bring themselves to actually destroy the most magnificent structures, and they decided to tell everyone a few of them were actually meant to be permanent. Or perhaps it was just plain greed. Here we see some of the structures that remain to this day, supposedly constructed for these World's Fairs. This is San Francisco, I believe. This is the Science Museum in Chicago. Palace of Fine Arts. This remains in Spain, the Magic Fountain. Again, the Palace of Fine Arts, and this is in St. Louis. And oh, what do we have here? We have actually some of the World's Fair structures being moved. Now, why would somebody take the expense to move a cheap plaster structure? Now, I don't even know how it might have stayed together when trying to pick it up and put it on a barge. This would only seem to make sense if someone recognized that these were permanent structures and they'd like to have them somewhere else. I'm sure the fair organizers would have said, well, you've got to get it out of here if you want it. And they did. And this was done a number of times. I know there's record of that in Philadelphia. A lot of the state houses were moved to New Jersey, I think. But just incredible to think that someone would want to move a temporary structure built of staff. And if it was permanent, why not keep it where it was? Anyway, just some eerie similarities that we find tied in with many, many of these World's Fairs. So Do all these mysterious similarities mean that all these fairs were simply a means to cover up a lost empire we stumbled onto? Well, perhaps not. I don't think there is at this time definitive proof for such a claim. However, I do feel there is abundant reason to question whether these buildings were here before the fairs. And if they were, why has such effort gone into eliminating these priceless pieces of our history? We may not ever know why these things may have been erased from our history, but we can find out if, in fact, they were erased. I've yet to see overwhelming evidence that these old world buildings were remnants of the lost empire of Tartaria. However, if not from Tartaria, where then? The evidence for these buildings being much older than claimed is compelling. So if not Tartaria, again, where from? What other civilization was claimed to be so vast and far-reaching as to fit the description? What other empire do we find evidence of that may have been erased from history books? Even if the connection cannot be definitively made, there are sure enough mysterious circumstances to wonder if, in fact, what we're seeing is the remains of that lost great empire of Tartaria. So I hope you'll join me as we explore some of these mysterious world's fairs as this series progresses. We'll go from a bird's eye view that we took today to examining some of the specific world's fairs and the official claims that in some cases seem crazier than the actual conspiracy theories. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm J. Trevor Adkins, and this is Quest Logos. Until next time, thanks for tuning in.